Welcome to Compact Mysteries from CompactHistories.com, the show where we try to unravel a different bite-sized mystery each week, from baffling disappearances and strange objects, to unexplained events and mysterious places. This is episode 76, The Mystery of the Shroud of Turin. The Shroud of Turin is, at first glance, an object of almost startling simplicity. A long piece of linen, pale with age, marked by the faint front and back image of a man. Yet few historical objects have carried such emotional, religious and scientific weight. To believers it may be the burial cloth of Jesus Christ, wrapped around his body after the crucifixion. To skeptics, it is a medieval creation whose power lies not in authenticity, but in human longing, devotion and mystery. The cloth is usually described as showing the image of a gaunt, wounded man, with markings that many have connected to the wounds of crucifixion. There appear to be injuries around the head, wounds to the wrists or hands, marks across the body resembling scourging, and stains long interpreted as blood. Its basic visual claim is therefore not subtle. This is not merely a holy cloth, but one that seems to present the body of a man who suffered in a way strikingly similar to the Gospel accounts of Jesus' death. The shroud measures roughly 4.3 meters long and 1.1 meters wide, and the image appears as if a body had been laid on one half of the cloth before the other half was folded over the front of the body. That is where the mystery begins, because the shroud is not simply a relic quietly accepted by the faithful. It sits at the crossroads of faith, medieval history, forensic investigation, chemistry, photography, textile analysis, and inevitably public argument. For some, it is a sacred witness to the central event of Christianity. For others, it is one of the most successful religious images ever produced. For many more, it is something awkwardly in between, too compelling to dismiss casually, yet too historically uncertain to accept without hesitation. The fascination is partly due to timing. The shroud claims to connect the modern viewer directly with the 1st century, but its securely documented history begins much later. That gap has allowed centuries of speculation to settle around it like dust on old stone. In a mystery worthy of the name, the most important question is not only what the object is, but how much of the story around it can actually be proved. The Shroud of Turin is a mystery where history, belief, science, and suspicion all keep interrupting one another. The cloth may be silent, but people have been arguing loudly around it for hundreds of years, which is usually a sign that something interesting is going on. The first major problem for the shroud is that its early history is not clear. If it truly belonged to the burial of Jesus, then the question becomes enormous. Where was it during the first centuries of Christianity, and why does its documented trail become firm only in medieval Europe? There are theories linking it to older relic traditions, hidden images and Byzantine treasures, but the strongest historical footing begins in 14th century France, not 1st century Jerusalem. The shroud appears in the historical record in Lirey, a village in France associated with Geoffroy de Charny, a French knight. By the late 1300s, it was already controversial, and Pierre d'Arcy, Bishop of Troyes, denounced it as false when it was exhibited. Anti-Pope Clement VII allowed it to be shown, but under the condition that it be presented as an image or representation rather than definitively as the true burial cloth. That distinction shows that doubts about the shroud are not a modern invention cooked up in a laboratory by people allergic to incense. They were there near the beginning of its documented public life. From Lirey, the shroud eventually passed into the hands of the House of Savoy in the 15th century. It was kept at Chambéry, where it suffered serious damage in a fire in 1532. Molten material from its container caused burn marks and holes, and the damage later had to be repaired by Poor Clare nuns. These scorch marks and patches became part of the shroud's physical identity, reminding anyone who looked at it that relics like people rarely pass through history without picking up scars. In 1578, the shroud was moved to Turin, where it has remained ever since. Its new home gave it the name by which it is now known around the world. Since then, it has been displayed only occasionally, drawing huge interest whenever the public has been allowed to view it. The Roman Catholic Church has treated it with reverence and allowed devotion connected to it, but it has not issued a final declaration that the shroud is unquestionably the authentic burial cloth of Jesus. This careful position has helped the shroud survive both devotion and doubt. It can be venerated without every historical and scientific question being settled. That may sound evasive, but it is also practical, because the shroud attracts certainty the way a candle attracts moths. Every camp wants it to say something final, while the actual evidence remains stubbornly complicated. The shroud changed from a famous relic into a modern mystery in 1898, when an Italian photographer named Secondo Pia took the first photographs of it. When he developed the images, he noticed something astonishing. The photographic negative seemed to reveal a much clearer, more lifelike image than the cloth itself. This discovery electrified interest in the shroud, because it suggested that the faint markings were not behaving like a normal painted image. To understand why that mattered, it helps to remember how the shroud looks in person. The image is faint, subdued, and difficult to read clearly at close range. It does not look like a dramatic medieval painting, full of colour and theatrical flourish. Instead, it appears ghostly and restrained, as though the cloth is withholding more than it reveals. That quality has been one of the reasons supporters argue that it was not created by ordinary artistic methods. The image also presents details that have intrigued researchers. The man appears front and back, aligned as if the cloth covered the body lengthwise. The wounds have been compared with crucifixion injuries, including marks consistent with scourging and apparent blood flows. Some have argued that the image contains three-dimensional information, meaning variations in image intensity may correspond in some way to the distance between cloth and body. That claim remains debated, but it has added to the sense that the shroud refuses to behave like a simple painting. There are also awkward questions. A cloth wrapped around a three-dimensional human body would normally be expected to distort an image when laid flat, especially around the sides of the face and body. Critics argue that the relatively recognizable front image may suggest an artistic or contact-based process, rather than a true burial wrapping. Others respond that the image may not have formed through ordinary contact at all, which moves the discussion from history into chemistry, physics, and sometimes very enthusiastic speculation. This is where the shroud becomes more than a question of whether people in the Middle Ages were capable of making impressive religious images. They absolutely were, and anyone who has seen medieval art knows they were not short of imagination. The harder question is whether known medieval techniques can fully explain this particular image. That question has produced a long-running contest between the apparently simple and the strangely elusive. By the 20th century, the shroud had become a scientific target as much as a devotional object. Researchers wanted to know whether the image was made by pigment, stain, scorching, chemical change, bodily contact, or some process not yet fully understood. The Shroud of Turin research project, commonly known as STURP, examined the cloth in 1978 and produced findings that were widely discussed, especially around whether the body image was painted. Britannica summarizes the broader scientific picture by noting that tests from the late 19th century onwards have not conclusively settled whether the images were caused by paint, pigments, scorching, or another agent. Supporters of authenticity often point to the absence of obvious brushstrokes and the superficial nature of the image on the fibers. They argue that the image is not made in the way a conventional painting would be made, and that no one has produced an exact duplicate using medieval materials and methods. This is a fair point in a limited sense, because failure to reproduce something perfectly can keep a mystery alive. However, it does not automatically prove that the object is ancient, miraculous, or connected to Jesus. Skeptics have countered with their own explanations. Some researchers, including the microscopist Walter McCrone, argued that the image could be explained through pigments and artistic technique. Others have suggested contact printing, bas-relief methods, chemical reactions, heat, or forms of medieval image making. The problem is that proposed explanations often solve one part of the mystery while creating another. A technique may explain the body shape but not the fiber chemistry, or it may explain the image tone but not the apparent lack of obvious brushwork. Blood evidence has also been central to the debate. If the stains are genuine blood, that supports at least the possibility that the cloth was in contact with a wounded body, though not necessarily the body of Jesus. If they are pigment, then the case for an artistic origin becomes stronger. As with almost everything about the shroud, the evidence has been interpreted differently by different specialists, and the arguments often depend on which tests, samples, and assumptions are trusted. This is why the shroud can feel like a courtroom drama in which every expert witness is cross-examined for several decades. The more it is studied, the more each side believes the other has missed the obvious. Yet for some, that is exactly the appeal. The shroud is not interesting because there is no evidence. It is interesting because there is too much evidence, too many interpretations, and not enough agreement. In 1988, the debate appeared to reach its decisive moment. Small samples from the shroud were given to laboratories in Arizona, Oxford, and Zurich for radiocarbon dating, with the British Museum involved in coordination and statistical analysis. The published result placed the linen between 1260 and 1390 with at least 95% confidence. That date range landed squarely in the medieval period, close to the shroud's first secure historical appearance, and far too late for the burial of Jesus. For many skeptics, this was the end of the matter. The cloth was medieval, the historical trail began in the medieval period, and the simplest explanation was that the shroud was a medieval religious image. The result was also difficult for supporters of authenticity because radiocarbon dating is not a vague impression or an aesthetic judgment. It is a scientific method designed precisely to answer questions about the age of organic materials. Yet the dating did not end the argument. Critics of the 1988 test questioned whether the sample area was representative of the whole cloth. Some argued that later repairs, contamination, fire damage, handling or environmental effects might have affected the result. Others objected to elements of the testing protocol or the way the samples were selected. The challenge for those objections is that they must explain not merely that something could have gone wrong, but that enough went wrong to shift a first-century cloth by more than 1,000 years. Later assessments have tended to regard the radiocarbon result as important and credible, while still acknowledging debate around methodology. A 1990 assessment in the journal Radiocarbon noted the 1260 to 1390 date range at 95% confidence, described the 3 laboratory testing, and concluded that the results were credible despite procedural differences from earlier recommendations. More recent studies have explored alternative approaches, including a 2022 study using wide-angle X-ray scattering that suggested structural features compatible with ancient linen. However, its researchers did not claim that it proved the shroud's authenticity. This leaves the shroud in a difficult position. The strongest single scientific result points to the Middle Ages. The strongest emotional and devotional tradition points to the Passion of Christ. Between those two stands a long list of theories, objections, studies, and counter-studies. It is the sort of debate where everyone reaches for certainty and comes back holding a footnote. So, what is the Shroud of Turin? The most cautious answer is that it is a medievally documented linen cloth bearing an extraordinary image of a crucified man. That answer is not as dramatic as saying it is definitely the burial cloth of Jesus, nor as satisfying as calling it simply a fake and walking away. But caution is useful here, because the shroud has spent centuries punishing overconfidence. If it is a medieval artwork, then it is still remarkable. It would represent an unusually powerful religious object, created in a way that continues to provoke technical debate. Medieval Europe was full of relics, pilgrimages, devotional images, and sacred theatre, and the shroud fits naturally into that world. It could have been designed to move viewers emotionally, encourage devotion, and bring the Passion of Christ into terrifying physical closeness. If so, it succeeded rather spectacularly, since people are still arguing about it centuries later. If it is older than the carbon dating suggests, then the mystery deepens. Supporters of authenticity must explain the medieval documentation gap, the radiocarbon result, and the absence of an unbroken early provenance. Skeptics must explain why the image has remained so difficult to reduce to one universally accepted method of production. In that space between historical record and physical analysis, the shroud continues to breathe as a mystery. The Vatican's careful position reflects that tension. The Church allows the shroud to be treated as an object of devotion and contemplation, but it has not required believers to accept it as genuine. That approach leaves room for faith without pretending that every scientific question has been settled. It also allows the shroud to function as an image of suffering, sacrifice, and hope, regardless of whether it is literally the cloth that wrapped Jesus. Perhaps that is why the shroud endures. It is not only a question of linen, fibers, stains, and dates. It is also a question of what people want from the past, especially when the past touches the sacred. Some want proof, some want disproof, and some simply stand before the image and feel the chill of history looking back. The mystery of the Shroud of Turin remains powerful because it refuses to belong entirely to one category. It is religious, but not only religious. It is scientific, but not only scientific. It is historical, but full of gaps. Whether relic, artwork, or unresolved enigma, it has become one of the most famous mysteries in the world. And like all great mysteries, it does not merely ask what happened. It asks why we are still so desperate to know. That brings us to the end of this episode of Compact Mysteries, part of the Compact Histories Network. If you enjoyed it, please follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so you don't miss any future episodes, and consider leaving a rating or review, as it really helps new listeners find the show. You can find more episodes at compactmysteries.com, where you can also explore our other podcasts covering biographies, history, disasters, warfare, and true crime. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest. Finally, please consider supporting the show directly by buying us a coffee. Head on over to compacthistories.com/mysteriescoffee to see how. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.